What's up? CJ here. In this video, I'm going to be holding office hours. So last week, I posted a video called Self-Host 101 that showed you how to set up and secure a VPS or virtual private server. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about some of the comments, questions, suggestions, corrections that appeared on that video. And all of these comments, questions, suggestions, corrections are coming from these fine people. So let's get into it. Before that, be sure to check out the post that I made over on X if you're looking for a VPS. So there are a few different places I listed where you can get a really cheap virtual private server if you want to start learning about this kind of thing, but definitely check the comments as well, because there's lots of good suggestions of other places to find cheap VPSs, or for instance, even places where you might be able to get one for free. But definitely check out that post if you're looking to get your own VPS. Now, our first question comes from badinfo259. And their question is how to get public IP. So when you're connecting to your VPS to configure it, you're going to need to connect over the public IP address. And this is going to vary depending on who your provider is. I have a few examples here, like Ionos has a dashboard and it shows your public IP there under like network. If you're using AWS Lightsail, you're going to see the IP address on the instance. And also you'll see a static IP if you've assigned it. If you're using Hetzner, there is a public IP section. If you're using Oracle, there's a section called Instant Access. So it's going to vary depending on provider. But one thing you want to look out for is make sure that it is a public IP address that you're trying to connect to. So if you're not familiar with public versus private networks, I did a video over on Coding Garden where I kind of break down the difference between them. But you can make a quick note of this. If you see an address that starts with 10, that's a private IP address. If you see an address that starts with 172.16 all the way up to 172.31, those are also private. And if you see an IP address that starts with 192.168, that is also a private IP address. So if you're trying to connect to these, the only way you're going to get connected to them is if you're also on the private network that the IP address that you're trying to connect to is on. So make sure it's a public IP. And then for any given provider, it's going to vary. So I would suggest just searching the web if you can't figure it out. Connect to VPS and then whoever you got your VPS from, and they should have some documentation on how to find that public IP and how to connect. Great question, though. Thank you for that. Next, we have two questions. So the first one is from Optimizer Pro, and it says, if I don't have my machine where I log in with my secondary user, how can I log into the server if the root is disabled as well? And then we have a question from Scott Walter, who says, what happens if you disable password login and lose your public key? So both of these have to do with potentially losing access to the server, because in the setup video, I talked about how to disable password auth over SSH and only allow public-private key authentication. But what if you lose that what if you lose that private key? How do you get in? And first we'll address connecting from a different machine, because you can actually set up multiple public keys on the server. So let's connect to my server and I will show you in the SSH folder. So if you cd into .ssh, you should have that authorized keys file where you put your public key. And then if you edit it, you can actually add multiple public keys inside of here. So each public key will just be on a new line. And so you can actually go set up your SSH keys on some other machine and then add the public key here as well. And also if you want to share access to the server with someone else, you can put their public key into this file. So that's one way to connect from multiple machines. Just make sure you have all of the public keys listed in this authorized keys file. Now, what happens if you completely lose access to the server? We'll talk about that, because that's what Scott is saying. It's like, what if I don't have my private key anymore, and we can't log in as root user? In this case, you're going to need to connect to the server in what is known as like console mode. And so again, this is going to vary depending on who your VPS provider is, but I have some examples. So if you're using Ionos, they have this drop down here that says open remote console. And this is not actually an SSH connection. This is using the hypervisor, or the thing that's actually hosting the VPS, to be able to connect directly to the machine. And you will be able to log in with the root user if you still remember the root password using that console mode. And so this, again, varies based on provider, but like on Hetzner, it's called rescue mode. So if you select rescue in the menu, that's going to put you into a console and you can use your root password to log in. But basically, that's what you're going to need. And if your provider doesn't have a console mode, then you're kind of out of luck. In that case, you would potentially just have to reset the VPS and set a new root password and be able to relog in. But eventually in this series, I'm also going to talk about the idea of backups. So that way, if something catastrophic like this happens and you can't get in anymore, if you do have to reload the VPS, you at least have a backup that you can work from. So we'll talk about that in a future video. But thank you to both Optimizer Pro and Scott for these questions. All right, your next question comes from Phil Sola, and it is, this is a great video for walking through VPS basic setup and security measures. Really enjoyed it. Looking forward to the next one. Thank you, Phil. One question for my own understanding. We do something similar already with SSH keys at my day job, but we use .pim keys to log in. Is there any difference or benefits to doing that than the way you're doing it without? There isn't. And a PIM file is actually a privacy enhanced mail file that has a specific format. So it has begin private key. You'll actually have your private key inside of there and then end private key. And you may not know this, but the SSH key that you generate to connect to a remote instance actually is a PIM file. It just doesn't have the extension. So if I look here on my local machine, you can see that I have this private key right here. But inside of that private key, it actually is just a PIM. It just doesn't have the PIM extension. And if we want to see an example of that, I am going to show the contents, but I'm not going to show my private key. I'm just going to grep for the string that should be in there, which is all caps private key. So if we say search that for private key, you'll see that inside of that, it actually is just a PIM file and it doesn't have that PIM extension. But what's happening on your machine when you attempt to connect to a remote server, it's going to attempt to use your private key to log in. So that's why we don't have to specify it here. We have it there in the .ssh folder and it's already been added to the SSH agent. And so it just happens by default. But when you're using a PIM file, you're just specifying the private key to use. So for example, we can actually connect by manually specifying that file there. So we can do SSH-I and then specify our PIM file and then the server that we want to connect to. So, and now we are explicitly saying, hey, use this key file to connect to the server. And so that's basically what's happening when you specify that PIM file. And this is actually a really common way to like share access to a server. You might have a way at your company of like checking out these PIM files and then using them to connect. But one cool thing you can do is you can actually add that PIM file to the SSH agent so you don't have to specify it manually every time. So you can actually do SSH agent add and then specify the PIM file that you want to add. Sorry, I think it's SSH add. Sorry, it's just SSH-add and then the PIM file. That adds it to the SSH agent, and now you should be able to connect it to that server without doing -I because the private key has actually been registered. So now that you've registered that private key, you should be able to connect and you don't have to specify it manually. So it's a great question, and it is interesting to see like the different ways of connecting to the server, but ultimately you are just using a private key, but you're using it manually. And the only difference is that key hasn't been added to the SSH agent. So thank you, Phil, for your question. Next question comes from Aztec, and their question is, how can you use something like zero tier or Tailscale to allow SSH from those VPN services? First, let's talk about what those are because they're actually new to me. So zero tier is a way to create and manage virtual software defined networks. And then Tailscale is a meshed virtual private network. But what I am familiar with are VPNs or virtual private networks. So these are just basically like, it seems like protocols like on top of VPNs. But what I am familiar with is like OpenVPN. So OpenVPN is a VPN server that you can set up. And this is another way to potentially lock down your server. You could use something like OpenVPN or even WireGuard. This is another very common one. And I'm sure that both Tailscale and zero tier would work in a similar way, where if you have your VPS connected to some VPN server, now your VPS will have a private IP within that VPN. And so we talked about private network addresses earlier. And again, check out that video over on Coding Garden if you want to kind of see me draw a diagram talking about the differences. But once your VPS is connected to some VPN, regardless of where it is or what kind it is, your VPS will then have a private IP address. So if you too connect to that VPN, now you have a private IP address as well. And then you'll be able to SSH into the machine. And also you would essentially set up some security rules for your firewall as well. And you can basically say only allow SSH attempts if they are coming from a private IP address. And so that way you don't have to open port 22 to the entire world or whatever port you're running SSH on. You can only open it up to a specific subnet range within a private IP block. And that way you're locking it down so that SSH can only happen from a private IP address. And essentially you would need to be connected to some VPN that your VPS is on to even get access to it. So this is one way to further lock down the machine, and it is it'll work regardless of what kind of VPN technology you use. As long as your VPS is on a VPN and you're on a VPN, then you'd be able to connect after you set up that security rule. So thank you, Aztec, for that question. Next up, we have a question from RaLacerDa12, who says, nice video. This video will be a great checklist for when I'm spinning up a new VPS. My question is, how much can you pack inside a 1 CPU, 1 gigabyte RAM VPS? Will it be able to run a simple SQLite database with Nuxt? And any tips on how to make the most of it? Now, first, thank you for your question, but this is going to vary widely depending on what you're actually trying to do with your VPS. And one of the things you can do is actually known as load testing. So I'll link this Wikipedia article here that talks about software load testing. Specifically, you want to do network load testing. And there's a couple of tools that are pretty popular. Like I've heard of JMeter, I've heard of Gatling, I've heard of Locust. These are all tools where you can simulate network traffic and see how your server responds. So because this is going to depend on your type of app and how fast it responds and everything else, this is something that you might want to do. Like put your app on the server, start running it, and then create some sort of load test to see how your server responds to it. Because all of these tools will show you like how long it takes to respond, how many requests it can handle, that kind of thing. And so that's really the only way you're going to know if the server can actually handle it. Now, on the surface, I think it can handle it. SQLite database, fine. Maybe a few hundred users accessing your app, totally fine. But again, it's going to depend on how much load your server is actually getting and how many users you have. But specifically for tips on how to make the most of it, I will say that if you are running some node type app on a server, you're always going to want to make sure you're running in production mode. So Nuxt specifically, if you just search their site for production, they have a section on making sure that Nuxt is production ready. And you're going to want to make sure that you follow that. And specifically, you're going to want to make sure that you build the app. You would be surprised at the number of people I have found who are just doing like npm run dev on a production server instead of building the app and then running the built files. And so that's definitely one thing you want to do because when you're running in dev, the code isn't as optimized. But if you build it, you're going to get code that can just be run directly with Node. It won't need like TS Node or anything like that. So definitely build your code. And then the other thing is you're going to want some kind of process manager, because if you just run this directly, if your server ever crashes and you don't have something watching that, then your server just crashes for everyone. But if you're running your app behind some sort of process manager, then it can automatically restart the process if it exits. So the Nuxt docs actually show you how to do this with PM2, and PM2 I'm familiar with. And you can actually create this ecosystem file, commit it to your source code. And then when you're running the app on the server after you've built it, you can just do a PM2 start, and it'll look at this file and determine how to start it. But it keeps track of all of the logs. You can set a log location. It automatically will restart if it crashes. So you definitely want to be running something like this. There are other tools for this as well. You can just use like systemd, which is built into Linux, to create your own service that automatically restarts on crash. But these are some of the things that you would want to do. Definitely in a future episode, I'm going to talk about more stuff you can do to make sure your app is running well in production, but that's at least a start. So thank you for your question. Next up, let's get into comments and corrections. So this first comment comes from Chris Clem, who says, can't you use SCP to copy your public key to your VPS? Let's touch on that really quick, because yes, you can. So when you're working with a remote server, typically you're going to want to figure out some way to get files onto that remote server, and SCP, or Secure Copy Protocol, is one way of doing that. So this is actually a command you can run that transfers files either from your local machine to some remote server over SSH, or from some remote server to your local machine. So you can transfer files in both directions, and it works over SSH. So you don't have to open up any other ports. You can just use the same SSH port that you're using to connect to the server to actually transfer files. And so SCP is one way to do it. You can check out this Wikipedia page where it talks about it. I'll also link to the TLDR page that shows you some common ways of running the command. But yes, if you want to get files from your machine to a remote machine, or from the remote machine to your machine, SCP is one way to do it. There are other ways. So things like SFTP, or even like putting something in a Git repo and then cloning it to the server. There's other ways which we'll touch on in future videos, but SCP is definitely one. All right, so the next thing Chris says is, there's also a way to add two-factor authentication using TOTP codes as a second form of authentication to the terminal. And Gadar also mentions, at work, we use SSH keys on a YubiKey and do not store them on our computers. So this is a further way to lock down logging into a VPS over SSH. And I've never done this before, but it seems pretty easy to set up. So specifically on Ubuntu, there is this package called libpam Google Authenticator, and you can set this up so that after connecting with your private key over SSH, it will then prompt you for a one-time code, and then you can use the Authenticator app to put that code in. So this is pretty slick. So it's basically adding two-factor auth over SSH. So that's one thing you can do. And then beyond that, what Gadar is mentioning is YubiKey. So if you haven't heard of YubiKey, it's a hardware tool for getting like one-time codes, and it can also store like private keys. It plugs in via USB, and like you touch it if you need to use it. And they actually have some documentation on setting up your YubiKey to have your private keys for SSH. And there's several different ways you can do it. I'll link to these docs here. But they also have their own one-time password way of doing this. So basically, you can have it so that you're connecting with your public-private key like you set up. But then once you're logged in, you'll be prompted, and then you can just tap your YubiKey, which will put in the one-time passcode. And so they have their own PAM module for this that you can build, or you might have to build it. Maybe you can find a place to install it from, but that'll work in a similar way to the one we saw for Google Authenticator, but it would let you use your YubiKey to be the one-time passcode as well. So those are really great suggestions, and one additional form of security that you can set up if you want to lock down the server further. Now, Gadar also mentions a thing called fail to ban. And so I didn't talk about that in the previous video, but we are definitely going to talk about it in future videos. And this is a really nice tool for automatically blocking repeated attempts to either like log in or request files from your server. So this is an open source package. You can set it up on a server. And one thing you can do is you can set up a rule that says, if you see multiple failed login attempts from a specific IP address, block that IP address at the firewall level. And one thing that we'll do in a future video is we'll set up fail to ban to block repeated failed requests. So sometimes attackers try to find files on your server by just brute forcing and requesting a bunch of different file names, like trying to find like /admin or something like that. And you can use fail to ban to look at your HTTP request logs. And if it sees a bunch of 404s or it sees specific kinds of requests, you can actually set up fail to ban that IP address from making requests to the server. Now, what's cool about fail to ban is you can also set it up in a way where it doesn't ban the IP address forever, because you could do something similar to how a website might lock you out from logging in for like 10 minutes. So let's say on a website, you type your password wrong 5 times, and then it's like, hey, you're locked out, try again in an hour or whatever else. Fail to ban also supports that. So instead of just completely blocking someone, you can set it up so that if there are a few failed attempts, block it temporarily and then unblock it. But then if you see more and more failed attempts, you can block it permanently. So fail to ban is pretty versatile in what you can do with it. And definitely you should check it out. But we are going to talk about it in a future video. So thank you to Chris Clem and Gadar both for your comments. These next comments come from Nutty Geek and Codemister, and they talk about configuring SSH to use a non-default port. And so in my video last week, I talked about how I like to just leave SSH running on port 22 because it's convenient to not have to specify the port. But they mention you can actually use the config file to specify the non-default port. And so let me show you what that looks like here. So on your local machine in your SSH folder, there's that config file. And if you take a look at it, you can actually add a section for a server. So you can see by default, I have this section in here for connecting to GitHub, and that's how it uses my private key. But I could add another section with my IP address of the server that I'm connecting to. And then there are several options you can specify here. And one of them is port. And so you can specify that some non-standard port. And now whenever you're connecting to this specific IP address over SSH, the SSH agent will look at this file and use the port that you specified here. So you don't have to specify it manually. So that's a really good tip. And then the other thing that Codemister mentioned is that you can specify a user there too. So this actually, we'll demonstrate this really quick. And so you can say user and then specify the user you want to connect to. So I'm just going to do 22 because I'm not going to change the port that SSH is running on my remote machine. But let me grab this IP address. And what we can do is after we've set this up, now, whenever I need to SSH, I don't have to specify my username. So if I save this config, now I can just do an SSH, specify the IP address. It's going to look in that config, use the port, use the username, anything else you configured inside of there, and automatically connect. So yeah, these are really good tips from Nutty Geek and Codemister. And you can also check out the SSH config man page that shows you all of the other things that you can put in that config file as well. Cool. This next comment also comes from CodeMister, and they made a really good point. So they said, I'm surprised this worked. You must have a very restrictive umask by default. And so they're talking about whenever I created that authorized keys file on the server. And so they give a suggestion for the type of mode that the file should be in whenever you create it. But let me show you what they're talking about. So I'm here on my remote VPS, and if I cd into that .ssh folder, we can do an ls-l and take a look at that authorized keys file. Now, you may not have known this, but this section that you see right here for any file when you're doing an ls-l, this is the mode of the file. And there are a few different sections. There's this section which says, what are the access rights of the owner? And in this case, I can read and write the file. And then you have the next three, which are, what are the access of the group? In this case, the file's group is the same as the owner. It's a group with my name in it. And then the last three are, what can everyone else on the machine do? And so you might have seen this chmod command. And this changes the mode of any given file. And so if I do 777, this is going to open it up to the world. So let's just do this really quick and then take a look at the mode. Now, if you look at it, now everyone can read, write, and execute. So this isn't good to have, because if there are some other users on this machine, they could potentially get access to this file and see and modify it. And like a malicious user could add their own public key in here and then log in as you remotely. So you definitely want to make sure that this has the right permissions. And the permissions, the most restrictive permissions you can use are 600. So if you do 6, that means read and write for the owner, and then everyone else can't read or write that file. So if I do 600, now you can see it has only rewrite privileges. So you want to make sure that it has that permission. And if you're getting some kind of error and you're not able to log in with your SSH key, it's probably because this file doesn't have the right permission. So thank you very much, CodeMister, for mentioning that. And I will direct you to also this chmod calculator. You can find a lot of different versions of this online, but essentially you can change read, write, and execute for owner, group, and public, and it'll show you what the corresponding value would be. So 777 is read, write, execute for all users. But if we go to the same permissions that I just set, and it is read and write only, then it's 600. So you can figure out what your mode wants to be and then specify that from the command line. But thank you very much, CodeMister. That's a great tip. All right. Next up are suggestions for next time. And there are quite a few. And this first one comes from Wanes Salam. And they said, excited for this series, would be interested to see server configuration with Caddy. That's coming up next. And Alex Din says, this is my first time. I like the YouTube suggestion. Very clear tutorial. And I like your energy. Thanks, EJ. Well, thank you, Alex. Thank you for commenting. And they said, can you please add to this tutorial how we can run Docker apps in a VPS and use a different domain name for each app running Nginx as a reverse proxy? I am going to show how to do this in the next video in this series. And this is related because you can actually set up reverse proxies with a thing called Caddy. So Caddy and Nginx are both types of HTTP servers. And they're just like a lot of other things, there's a lot of options. So you could use something like Caddy server. You could use Nginx. I have the most experience with Nginx. I used it for years, but more recently I switched over to Caddy because it's so easy to configure. But you can use something like Nginx. There's also Apache HTTP server. There's also a thing called Trafic, but all of these tools allow you to set up what is called a reverse proxy. So I'm going to do my best to just kind of like diagram really quick what's happening with a reverse proxy. And regardless of if you have apps running inside of Docker, really if you have multiple apps running on the server, some of them might be running in Docker, but those ports are exposed and you might want to set up a reverse proxy. So let me actually just show you a quick little drawing of what that means. So let's say you have here on your VPS, you have an app running, and it is running on port 3000. Now, let's say you have your firewall set up, and you only open port 80, and you only open port 443. Now, when a user comes to your site, let's say like over HTTPS, and let's say you want to serve up the app that's running on port 3000, this is what a reverse proxy can do. And beyond that, you can also set this up with DNS. So let's say we set up a DNS record for app.example.com, and then we have an A record set that points to the IP address, the public IP. I'm putting a private IP, but let's say you have an A record that points that domain to the public IP address of your server. Now, when a request comes to this specific domain, it'll come to this server, but then you need some HTTP server running that can redirect that request. And this is what something like Caddy or Nginx or Apache HTTP will let you do. Is you can set up a config that says when a request comes into the server for this specific domain, then route that request to the application running on port 3000 and then send the traffic in that way. And what's nice is you can actually set up multiple of these. So like if you had another app running, let's call this app 2, and it's running on port 5000, you could have another domain, let's say like another example.com. And if you set up the config that says when a request comes to another example.com, forward that request to the app running on port 5000. And so then you have that reverse proxy there. And another example.com, for instance, would actually have a DNS record pointed to that same IP address. And so this is basically, I'm going to do a better job of explaining this in the next video, but we're going to set this up in the next video. But I encourage you to try it. You can do this with Caddy, you can do this with Nginx, but essentially you can have any number of domains pointed at a server, and then you basically just have an HTTP server sitting right here listening on port 80 and 443 that's ready to forward those requests to different services running on the machine. The other thing is it doesn't even have to be running on a port. You can also set up these tools to statically serve up files. So you could have just a directory called like www. You could have like an index.html inside of there, and you could set it up so that for one specific domain, when a request comes into this server, just serve up that static file instead of needing an app running on a port. So as a quick and dirty explanation, I think you can figure it out though. You don't need to wait for my video. I think the only difference between me and you is that like I've failed 100 times at trying to set this kind of stuff up. But I believe in you. You can fail too. So try your best. Look through the docs. I have confidence that you can set this up. But essentially, if you look in any of the documentation for any of the HTTP servers that I mentioned, they're going to have something on setting up a reverse proxy, and they're going to talk about specific examples on how to do that. So thanks for your suggestions. This will be in the next video. So stay tuned for that. Okay, and then lastly, Belkachik is asking, are you going to cover Cloudflare? I am. So I actually have a domain pointed at my server, and I'm using Cloudflare to do that. Now, Cloudflare is a DNS provider. They have a lot of other services too, but regardless of where you buy your domain, you can actually change the name servers to Cloudflare and then do all of your DNS settings inside of Cloudflare. And so that's what I'm actually doing for this example server that I'm setting up in the series. And they have a really generous free tier. And one of the cool things that you can get for free as well is the distributed denial of service protection. So in the dashboard, after you've set up these domains, they actually have a checkbox you can check. And let's say your server is getting a bunch of requests all of a sudden, you can check that box, and now Cloudflare will put a CAPTCHA for people that are trying to get to your website. And you've probably experienced this before. Like you're trying to get to some website and they're like, prove that you're human before I'll let you in. And that's the kind of service that Cloudflare can provide as well. They do other things, but that's just one thing that they do, which is pretty nice because you literally check a box and then it adds that CAPTCHA. All right. That is all the questions and comments that I'm covering in this video. Thank you for watching. And if you have more questions, let us know in the comments. Part of making this series is just trying to help people, right? And so I really do enjoy any good comments, bad comments, corrections. Like we want all of this stuff to be technically correct. So yeah, anything you have to say, we'd love to hear it. Just let us know down in the comments. And especially if you have more questions about the stuff that I talked about here today. I will also mention this video is brought to you by Sentry. So Sentry is an error monitoring platform. They will let you know about errors that are happening in production for your app, and you can see a nice dashboard of the errors that have occurred and when they've occurred and how often they've occurred and stuff like that. It's pretty slick. If you want to get 2 months free, use code Tasty Treats. You can also go to sentry.io/syntax, or relevant to this series, you can also host it yourself. So if you didn't know, Sentry is actually open source, and you can run it on your own server if you want to. So I'll link to this in the description as well. So if you're interested in trying to run Sentry on your own server, you can, and you don't even have to pay for it, which is pretty slick. But all right, that's all I have in this video. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next week when we continue the series. So see you in the next one.